Okay, so you want to own a watch brand, a tiny mechanical movement built from hundreds of hand-finished parts smaller than a grain of rice, a name engraved on a dial that signals decades of accumulated craft heritage, a waiting list of customers begging to pay six figures for a piece of steel and sapphire crystal. You picture yourself as the custodian of horological tradition, presiding over a workshop where time itself is quite literally handmade. That's the fantasy. Here's the actual business hiding underneath it. An industry where the actual movement inside a $15,000 watch might cost less than $1,000 to produce, where a single supplier controls the mechanical heartbeat of an enormous share of the entire Swiss watch industry, and where the difference between a watch that appreciates faster than almost any other consumer good and one that becomes worthless the moment you walk out of the boutique often comes down to a waiting list that the brand itself deliberately, permanently refuses to eliminate. Some watch brands have built genuine investment-grade assets that trade on secondary markets for multiples of retail price. Others, despite genuinely excellent engineering, sell at a steep discount the moment they leave the shelf, gathering dust in a display case nobody's fighting to buy from. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why owning a watch brand is simultaneously one of the most mechanically fascinating and one of the most artificially engineered businesses in all of luxury goods. What you're actually buying before the money makes sense. You need to understand that the watch industry is really three fundamentally different businesses wearing the same wrist. The first is true haute horlogerie, brands like Patek Philippe or Audemars Piguet that design, engineer, and manufacture their own movements entirely in-house, often incorporating complications, additional mechanical functions beyond simply telling time, like a perpetual calendar or a minute repeater, that can take a single watchmaker weeks to assemble and regulate by hand. The second is the manufacturer-adjacent tier, brands like Rolex and Omega that produce their own movements at genuine industrial scale, achieving a level of manufacturing consistency and volume that the true haute horlogerie houses, by design, never attempt to match, since their entire business model depends on scarcity rather than scale. The third, and by far the largest tier by unit volume, is the established brand that does not manufacture its own movement at all, instead purchasing a base movement from one of a small handful of specialized movement manufacturers and modifying, decorating, or simply cased it under their own name, a model that has been the industry norm for the overwhelming majority of Swiss watch brands throughout the industry's modern history. This third category exists specifically because building a genuine in-house movement manufacturing capability requires an enormous, multi-decade capital investment in specialized tooling and watchmaking talent that only a small handful of brands, almost all of them owned by one of the major luxury conglomerates, have ever been able to justify. Understanding which of these three tiers a given brand occupies explains almost everything about its cost structure, its pricing power, and critically, whether its watches hold value on the secondary market or depreciate the moment they leave the boutique. Because the market has become increasingly sophisticated about distinguishing between a watch that represents genuine in-house engineering scarcity and one that represents, however beautifully finished, a shared mechanical platform available to a dozen other brands at a fraction of the price. The movement monopoly here is the single fact that has shaped the entire structure of the Swiss watch industry for decades, and it explains a genuinely strange amount of consolidation and vertical integration you'll see if you study who owns what across the luxury watch landscape. A company called ETA, a subsidiary of the Swatch Group, has historically supplied the base mechanical movement used inside a substantial share of all Swiss watches, meaning an enormous number of ostensibly competing watch brands were, for decades, all building their products around mechanical hearts sourced from the same single supplier, one that happened to be owned by one of their most direct competitors. According to reporting on the Swiss watch industry structure, Swatch Group's decision beginning in the 2000s to progressively restrict and reduce third-party access to ETA movements, specifically to favor its own owned brands, sent a genuine shockwave through the independent watch industry, forcing dozens of brands that had no in-house movement manufacturing capability of their own to either scramble to develop that capability from scratch at enormous cost and over a multi-year timeline, or seek out alternative movement suppliers like Salita, a Swiss manufacturer that has positioned itself specifically an ETA-compatible alternative supplier for the broader industry. This single supply chain dynamic explains why so many watch brands that seem, on the surface, like fiercely independent competitors are in fact deeply intertwined through shared component sourcing, and it's exactly why the industry's major conglomerates, the Swatch Group and Richemont chief among them, have spent decades acquiring not just watch brands themselves, but the specialized component manufacturers, the dial makers, the case manufacturers, the hairspring producers that sit further up the supply chain, since controlling that manufacturing infrastructure provides genuine strategic leverage over independent competitors who remain dependent on the same limited pool of specialized Swiss component suppliers that has historically served the entire industry. The cost of actually making the thing manufacturing a genuine mechanical watch, particularly one built around an in-house movement, involves a level of manufacturing precision and hand finishing that few other consumer products require, and understanding the actual cost structure reveals why this industry commands the margins it does. According to industry analysis of watch manufacturing economics, the movement itself, meaning the mechanical engine that actually powers the watch, typically represents anywhere from 20 to 40% of a watch's total manufacturing cost depending on its complexity, with a simple, high-volume, externally sourced movement costing a brand perhaps $50 to $200 wholesale, while a genuinely complex in-house movement with multiple complications can cost tens of thousands of dollars to produce even before it's cased. Given the sheer number of hand-finished components and the specialized watchmaker labor required to assemble and regulate it to the precision required, case manufacturing represents another significant cost category, and here the material matters enormously. A stainless steel case costs a fraction of what a solid gold or platinum case costs in raw material alone, and this is precisely why steel sports watches from prestigious brands, despite being made from a comparatively inexpensive material, have become some of the most sought-after and highest appreciating pieces in the entire secondary market. A genuinely counterintuitive dynamic we'll return to shortly: hand finishing, the specific decorative techniques applied to movement components, perlage, quites de Genève, black polishing, that serve no functional purpose whatsoever but represent an enormous amount of skilled manual labor, is where haute horologerie brands justify a substantial share of their premium, since these finishing techniques can add days of additional skilled labor to a single movement's production, entirely invisible to anyone who isn't specifically looking for it through a loupe. According to industry reporting on watchmaking labor, a skilled watchmaker capable of assembling and regulating a complicated movement represents a genuinely scarce, specialized skill set that takes years of formal training to develop, and the industry has invested heavily in dedicated watchmaking schools specifically because the pipeline of qualified watchmakers has struggled to keep pace with demand at the industry's most prestigious tier. The waiting list economy here's the detail that genuinely confuses people who assume standard consumer economics apply to this business. For a small handful of the industry's most prestigious sports watch references, the brand could almost certainly sell every single unit it produces instantly at a considerably higher price than its official retail price, and yet deliberately chooses not to, maintaining an official retail price meaningfully below what the market has repeatedly demonstrated it would actually pay. This is not an accident or an oversight. It's a deliberate strategic choice with real commercial logic behind it. According to extensive reporting and analysis from secondary market watch dealers and price tracking services like Watch Charts and Chrono24, certain steel sports watches from brands like Rolex and Patek Philippe have traded on the secondary, or gray, market at prices running 50% to over 200% above their official retail price for years at a time, meaning a watch with an official retail price of $10,000 might reliably fetch $20,000 to $30,000 on the resale market to a buyer willing to skip the years-long waiting lists that authorized dealers maintain. For these specific references, the brand's reasoning for maintaining an artificially low retail price, effectively leaving enormous margin on the table that a reseller captures instead, comes down to protecting long-term brand positioning. A watch's official retail price functions as a permanent public anchor point for the entire brand's value perception, and dramatically raising that price to capture the secondary market premium would risk making the brand feel less accessible, in a purely aspirational sense, to the broader collector base who may never actually secure an allocation, but whose desire to own the watch someday is precisely what sustains the brand's cultural cachet. This waiting list dynamic has become genuinely central to how the industry's most prestigious brands manage their retail relationships. Authorized dealers frequently maintain private waiting lists for their most loyal, highest-spending customers, and it has become a widely reported practice within the industry for a dealer to require a customer to purchase several other, less desirable watches from the brand's catalog, sometimes informally called add-ons, before being offered an allocation of the specific highly sought-after reference they actually want, a system that effectively distributes the retail markup across the dealer's broader inventory rather than concentrating it entirely on the single scarce watch everyone is actually trying to buy, the bill that never stops arriving running. An established watch brand involves several categories of ongoing expense that extend well beyond simply manufacturing the watches themselves. Retail and boutique operations represent a substantial and growing cost category, since the industry's major brands have increasingly moved away from relying purely on third-party authorized dealers and toward operating their own directly owned boutiques in prestigious shopping districts, a strategy that provides considerably more control over the customer experience and, crucially, over exactly who gets access to the most sought-after references, but which also carries the same extraordinary prime retail rent costs we discussed in luxury fashion, on top of the specialized staff training required to sell a product where the sales associate's product knowledge and relationship with the customer often matters as much as the watch itself. Marketing spend in this industry carries a genuinely distinctive character, since watch brands have historically invested enormous sums in sports sponsorships, tennis, golf, sailing, and motorsport in particular, along with celebrity brand ambassador relationships, precisely because these associations reinforce the precision, performance, and aspirational lifestyle narrative that justifies the premium price. And according to industry reporting on luxury watch marketing spend, sponsorship and ambassador deals at the industry's top tier can run into the tens of millions of dollars annually for a single brand's portfolio of athlete and celebrity relationships. Research and development for genuine in-house movement manufacturing represents one of the largest and most sustained cost categories for any brand attempting to compete at the manufacture tier, since developing a new movement caliber from scratch, including the specialized tooling required to produce components to the precision tolerances the industry demands, can require years of engineering work and tens of millions of dollars in investment before a single watch containing that movement is ever sold, a cost that only makes commercial sense when spread across a movement architecture that will remain in production, with incremental refinements, for a decade or more. Servicing and after-sales support represents a genuinely long-tail cost obligation unique to this industry, since a mechanical watch is designed and marketed as an object intended to last, potentially for generations, meaning brands maintain service centers and stock replacement parts for decades after a specific model has been discontinued, a customer service commitment that functions as both a genuine cost center and a meaningful part of the brand's promise of enduring quality that justifies the original purchase price. How the money actually comes back. Revenue architecture of a successful watch brand reveals a business considerably more concentrated than the broad product catalogs displayed in a boutique window might suggest. According to industry analysis of luxury watch sales data, a remarkably small number of iconic, Instantly recognizable references frequently account for a disproportionate share of a major brand's total revenue and profit, meaning the broader catalog of less iconic models often exists primarily to provide price point accessibility and creative range, rather than functioning as genuine profit drivers in their own right. A dynamic with clear echoes of the accessible luxury versus runway collection split we discussed in fashion. Just with steel sports watches playing the role handbags play in that industry. Gross margins at the strongest watch brands. According to financial disclosures from the publicly traded luxury conglomerates that own major watch labels, commonly run in a range that rivals or exceeds the strongest luxury fashion houses, frequently 60% or higher at the industry's most prestigious tier, reflecting the same brand equity-driven pricing dynamic we've discussed throughout this series, where the gap between manufacturing cost and retail price is driven overwhelmingly by accumulated brand heritage and manufactured scarcity rather than by materials, or even by the genuinely substantial skilled labor involved. The secondary and pre-owned watch market has become an increasingly significant, if indirect, revenue consideration for major brands over the past decade, and several of the industry's largest names have moved to directly participate in this market rather than simply watching independent resellers capture the premium, launching officially certified pre-owned programs that allow the brand to capture a share of the resale transaction while also exercising quality control over the secondary market circulation of their own products, a strategic response to the reality that a thriving, transparent secondary market, where collectors can see real transaction prices climbing well above retail, has become one of the most powerful marketing tools the industry has. Since nothing reinforces a brand's desirability quite as effectively as watching its products trade for multiples of what they originally cost, the volatility nobody wants to talk about despite the extraordinary margins available at the top of this industry, watch brand ownership carries genuine risks that can meaningfully affect even well-run, historically prestigious houses. The most immediate risk is consumer discretionary spending cyclicality, since a mechanical watch, regardless of how it's marketed, remains a genuinely discretionary luxury purchase that customers can and do defer during periods of economic uncertainty. And according to industry analysis tracking the sector's recent performance, the secondary watch market in particular experienced a genuinely sharp correction following its extraordinary pandemic-era boom, with prices for several previously red-hot references falling substantially from their peak as pandemic-driven discretionary spending patterns normalized and interest rate increases affected the broader luxury asset class, a correction that caught a meaningful number of speculative secondary market buyers, people who had purchased watches purely as an investment vehicle rather than out of genuine collecting interest. In a genuinely difficult financial position, brand dilution risk operates similarly to what we discussed in luxury fashion, since a watch brand's entire pricing power depends on maintaining genuine scarcity and exclusivity, and a brand that responds to strong demand by simply increasing production volume, rather than maintaining discipline around scarcity even at the cost of leaving obvious short-term revenue on the table, risks permanently damaging the waiting list dynamic and secondary market premium that justifies its pricing in the first place, a mistake that industry analysts have pointed to at various points across the sector's history as a key factor separating brands that have sustained genuine collector demand for decades from those that experienced a temporary boom followed by a meaningful, reputational and pricing correction. Supply chain concentration represents a third, less visible but genuinely serious risk, given the movement monopoly dynamics discussed earlier, since a brand without genuine in-house movement manufacturing capability remains structurally dependent on a small handful of specialized component suppliers, and any disruption to that supply chain, whether from a supplier's strategic decision to restrict access, a genuine production capacity constraint, or a broader industry consolidation that changes who owns which component manufacturer, can directly threaten a brand's ability to produce its products at all, a risk that has driven considerable strategic urgency across the industry toward vertical integration and in-house manufacturing capability over the past 2 decades specifically to reduce this dependency. The real case study. The quartz crisis to understand how dramatically an entire industry's economics can be upended by a single technological shift. Look at what happened to Swiss watchmaking during the period the industry itself still refers to as the quartz crisis. Spanning roughly the 1970s through the mid-1980s, Japanese manufacturers, Seiko chief among them, commercialized quartz movement technology, an electronic timekeeping mechanism dramatically more accurate and considerably cheaper to manufacture at scale than traditional mechanical movements, and the Swiss industry, having built its entire manufacturing base and competitive identity around mechanical watchmaking craft, was catastrophically slow to recognize the commercial threat this represented, largely because quartz technology had actually been developed in part by Swiss research institutions, but was not aggressively commercialized by the Swiss industry itself, allowing Japanese manufacturers to capture the technology's commercial value instead. According to widely cited industry accounts of this period, the Swiss watch industry's total workforce contracted by roughly 2/3 over this period, and the number of active Swiss watch-making companies fell dramatically, as the industry proved structurally unable to compete on price and accuracy against cheap, reliable quartz movements flooding the global market from Japanese manufacturers, and numerous historically significant Swiss brands and component manufacturers went bankrupt or were absorbed into surviving competitors during this brutal consolidation period. The industry's eventual recovery came through a strategic pivot that remains the foundation of how the Swiss watch industry positions itself to this day, rather than attempting to compete with quartz technology on accuracy or price. An unwinnable fight given the fundamental physics involved. Surviving Swiss brands repositioned mechanical watchmaking specifically as a luxury craft product, emphasizing precisely the qualities that quartz technology couldn't replicate: hand finishing, mechanical complexity, heritage, and status, rather than timekeeping accuracy. A repositioning that required convincing an entire generation of consumers that a mechanical watch's inherent technical inferiority to a $5 quartz watch was in fact irrelevant to its actual value proposition. This repositioning was executed substantially through the creation of the Swatch Group itself, formed through the merger and rescue of several failing Swiss watch conglomerates specifically to stabilize the industry's manufacturing base, while the surviving prestige brands executed this repositioning toward mechanical craft rather than technical performance. A strategic pivot so successful that it laid the direct groundwork for the mechanical watch industry's genuine renaissance and the extraordinary secondary market premiums we see on certain references today. The quartz crisis remains the single clearest illustration in this entire industry of a structural lesson that echoes across nearly every business we've examined in this series. A product's value is never simply a function of its technical performance. It's a function of the story and status the brand has successfully attached to it, and an entire industry that had spent centuries building genuine engineering credibility nearly collapsed because it initially failed to recognize that the story, not the mechanism, was what its customers were actually buying. To scenarios, let's build the honest math the way an actual owner has to run it. In the good scenario, you own an established watch brand with genuine in-house movement manufacturing capability, a small number of instantly recognizable, historically significant references that anchor the brand's entire identity, and the disciplined restraint to maintain official retail pricing below what secondary market demand would clearly support. Sustaining a genuine multi-year waiting list at your authorized dealer network, your annual production across these anchor references might be genuinely modest in absolute unit terms compared to a mass-market watch company, but at gross margins commonly exceeding 60%, and with the secondary market consistently validating your pricing discipline by trading your products at a substantial premium to retail, your brand equity continues compounding year over year. Your dealer network remains fiercely loyal precisely because an allocation of your product represents genuine value they can pass to their best customers, and your marketing spend on sponsorships and ambassadors functions more as brand reinforcement than genuine customer acquisition. Since demand for your anchor references already exceeds supply by a wide margin, a well-run brand in this position, particularly one benefiting from a major luxury conglomerate's shared manufacturing and retail infrastructure, can generate operating margins that rival the strongest houses in luxury fashion, with the added structural advantage that your product's secondary market performance functions as a permanent, self-reinforcing marketing campaign that costs you nothing to run. Now the harder scenario. You own a brand without genuine in-house movement manufacturing capability, dependent on externally sourced movements from the same limited pool of Swiss suppliers that serves a dozen ostensibly competing brands, meaning your ability to differentiate your product on genuine mechanical merit is limited, and your pricing power depends almost entirely on marketing and brand story rather than any defensible manufacturing scarcity. When consumer discretionary spending softens, whether from broader economic conditions or simply from a correction in the kind of speculative secondary market enthusiasm that characterized the pandemic-era watch boom, your brand lacks the genuine waiting list dynamic that would otherwise cushion demand, and you find your watches sitting in dealer inventory at or below retail price rather than commanding the kind of secondary market premium that reinforces desirability. A dynamic that can trigger a genuinely difficult cycle where discounting to move inventory further erodes the brand perception that justified your pricing in the first place. Meanwhile, your marketing costs, the sponsorships and ambassador deals that were meant to build the aspirational story your manufacturing scarcity doesn't provide, remain largely fixed even as revenue softens. Since exiting a multi-year sponsorship commitment mid-contract is rarely a realistic option, the gap between these two scenarios is a modest difference in margin. It's the difference between owning one of the most durable brand equity businesses in all of luxury goods and owning a considerably more fragile marketing-dependent business competing on shared mechanical components against brands with genuine, defensible manufacturing scarcity. The real payoff: the difference between watch brands that build lasting, appreciating value across generations, and those that quietly become a discount rack item despite genuinely excellent engineering comes down to a small number of disciplined choices that echo directly across every business we've examined in this luxury series. Protecting scarcity, specifically the discipline to maintain a waiting list even when the brand could almost certainly sell every unit instantly at a considerably higher price, has proven again and again to be the single most powerful and most difficult to execute driver of long-term brand value in this entire industry, precisely because it requires consciously leaving enormous short-term revenue on the table in service of a long-term positioning strategy that takes years, sometimes decades, to fully compound. Investing in genuine, defensible manufacturing capability, whether through in-house movement production or the accumulated hand-finishing craft that a shared movement platform simply cannot replicate, provides the kind of structural moat that pure marketing spend never can. Since a competitor can always outspend you on sponsorships, but cannot simply purchase decades of accumulated watchmaking expertise or the specific supply chain relationships that took generations to build, and understanding, as the surviving brands of the quartz crisis eventually learned at enormous cost, that this industry has never actually been about timekeeping accuracy. It's about craft, heritage, and status, means resisting the temptation to compete on the wrong axis entirely, whether that's chasing technical specifications that a $5 quartz movement already handles better, or chasing production volume that permanently damages the exact scarcity dynamic the entire pricing structure depends on. The romance of the hand-finish movement, the decades-long waiting list, the watch passed down across generations, is genuinely real, and it's precisely that romance, protected with a discipline that runs directly counter to almost every normal business instinct to sell more product faster, that has made certain watch references appreciate more reliably than almost any other consumer good on earth. Which means the honest answer to whether owning a watch brand can make you extraordinarily wealthy is yes, unambiguously, for the handful of houses that have mastered this specific, counterintuitive combination of genuine manufacturing craft and disciplined scarcity. But the brands that sustain that wealth across generations are the ones that understood, long before the market forced the lesson on them, that the movement inside the case was never really the product. The waiting list was. And subscribe to Alma Discover for more videos. Thank you.